Israel is already fighting a war on two fronts, because while it is fighting a variety of Palestinian terror groups in the Gaza Strip, not just Hamas, they include the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, elements of the PFLP, groups affiliated with the PLO organization Fatah in the West Bank. Members of all of those groups infiltrated Israeli territory on the 7th of October and committed those atrocities and continue to fire missiles onto the Israeli civilian population for the last 2 weeks. That is a situation in Gaza. In the north, Israel is being attacked by another Iranian terror proxy, Hezbollah, and the civilian populations, both the south and the north of Israel, bordering these terror organizations, have been evacuated so far. So this is a war on multiple fronts, as I indicated, by Iranian terror proxies. And Israel's responsibilities, just like any democratic elected government, is to keep its citizens safe. As a state, it has to put its citizens' safety as its ultimate priority. But Israel also has obligations under international law, as every state does, including under Security Council Resolution 1373, to combat terror organizations, including to prevent their direct and indirect funding, and a responsibility under the Convention Against Genocide to make sure that never again means never again. And when one takes into consideration Israel's responsibilities to its citizenry, to ensure that genocide is punished and prevented, and also as a bulwark for the rest of the world, then Israel's responsibilities to eradicate Hamas and ensure that something like this does not happen again is multifaceted. And the reason that I say Israel is the bulwark against ISIS-like terror that has erupted here is because they make it clear, although their primary aim is the genocide of the Jews, it is Western liberal democratic values that are at stake here. And those don't just reside in Israel, but they reside in all freedom-loving democracies. There is no legal obligation to provide a terror organization that is seeking your destruction with any supplies, although Israel has, without obligation, provided about 50% of electricity of their electricity to Gaza, estimates between 5 and 12% of the water to Gaza, until, of course, this war began. The only responsibility that Israel has under international law, under Article 23 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, is to facilitate the passage of supplies by third parties if, and there is this qualification, if these supplies are not going to be diverted to the enemy terrorist group. And the difficulty here, of course, is anyone who has watched the situation in Gaza over the last 16 years, is that Hamas controls Gaza. They are the men with guns. And there is evidence after evidence of Hamas diverting these supplies for its own uses. And in particular, concern, I would say at the moment, that the supplies that are being allowed in, and the recent update from the Prime Minister of Israel is that supplies will be allowed in to the south of Gaza on a continual basis. The real concern is what might be being smuggled in with these supplies, because Hamas has infiltrated humanitarian organizations and NGOs in the Gaza Strip, and it is well known that they smuggle in terror resources to continue their fight against Israeli civilians through these mechanisms. But from an international law perspective, Israel is going over and above its responsibilities and its obligations in international law at the moment. It is beyond the call of duty. It goes further than any other modern military, or in fact, if one takes the analysis of leading experts like Colonel Richard Kemp, I believe he called Israel the most moral army in the history of warfare to the UN Human Rights Council. And the reason that that analysis stands true is because the IDF takes unprecedented measures to warn civilians, and we have seen this in the context of every operation in Gaza in 2008, in 2014, also with respect to its combating Palestinian Islamic Jihad in 2021. And the measures that Israel takes includes warnings to individual householders, phone calls, text messages, telling civilians, and of course the Hamas terrorists, giving them the same warning. So the impact on the effectiveness of their ability to strike against these terrorists is undeniably compromised, but they do it to try and minimize civilian collateral damage as much as possible. In addition to those warnings, the precision strikes that Israel adopts are to satisfy the principle under international law of proportionality and reduce the amount of civilian deaths as much as they are possibly able. You may also have heard of the technique which has been dubbed knock-on roof. This involves the IDF firing a warning shot at any building as a final warning for any civilians that have failed to heed the previous warnings that a strike is imminent. And it is because of these measures, and of course, we have to consider the other side of this equation is that Hamas uses civilians as human shields and cynically exploits international public opinion by creating as many civilian deaths in Gaza as possible. That despite all of these efforts by the IDF, there are two things that have resulted. One is undeniably casualties in the Gaza Strip, and the other is that over the last 16 years, Hamas have been able to continue to build up their terror resources. I would issue one final word of warning, if I may, a word of caution, which is that the casualty figures coming out of the Gaza Strip are part of the Hamas propaganda machine. The figures released by the Palestinian Ministry of Health are controlled by Hamas, and they make no distinction between combatants and civilians. And it is truly troubling that we are seeing international media repeating those figures as they repeat other Hamas propaganda, including blaming Israel for strikes against civilians, which has subsequently been proved were in fact Palestinian terrorist groups. So the fact that we are having this amount of misinformation being readily repeated in media around the world is distorting the facts and the truth of the situation, and undeniably impacting public opinion significantly. And what we have seen is an evolution of anti-Semitism. The late Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sacks talked about anti-Semitism as a mutating virus, one that began with the traditional blood libels in the Middle Ages, and these were widely believed myths that Jews killed Christian children in order to use their blood in religious rituals. They were, of course, untrue, but they were widely believed in the same way that the modern blood libels are widely believed. Lord Sacks described the evolution of anti-Semitism and this mutating virus, which shifted from a focus on religion, Jews as a religion, to Jews as a race. And the pseudoscience of eugenics was used by the Nazis to justify their hatred of the Jewish race. Well, bringing the mutating virus up to date, Lord Sacks talked about the order of the day being international law and human rights, and the focus of the hatred against the Jews, rather than on their race alone, has mutated to focus on the Jewish state, the only Jewish state, and international law and human rights principles are being manipulated and abused in order to back up these modern blood libels. So I think it's an uncomfortable truth, to be sure, but a very important one for us to begin to internalize so that we can see the level of reporting, but also the public sentiment and what we have witnessed increasingly on the streets of the United Kingdom, because undoubtedly this has all played into these developments. One sees all sorts of arguments being raised in international legal circles and especially in academia, but I think it's clear that any international lawyer or indeed military expert worth their salt recognizes that the IDF party here to this conflict, upholds the laws of armed conflict. Israel is a democracy, and its citizen army is accountable to the people. It is accountable in the courts, and there are NGOs in Israel that ensure that accidents or any sense of wrongdoing is investigated. Not least, the government does that also, and those issues are publicly aired. And one has seen, after every previous operation, reports into accusations, investigations that have been conducted that have held up the standards that the IDF adhere to and confirmed internationally that it is indeed complying with international law. And of course, the flip side of that, unfortunately, is that the modus operandi of these terrorist organizations is to abuse the principles of international law and break it in order to seek an advantage against law-abiding democratic states. It was the same, of course, in terms of the war against ISIS and other aspects of the war against terror. There is one aspect of this which is deeply troubling, and we are seeing this across academia, and that is an attempt to justify what happened on the 7th of October and what has been happening subsequently with misinformation and a mistelling of history. And the fact that those arguments and those misrepresentations are gaining traction in academia is deeply troubling. It is filtered down into student organizations on campuses across the world. And it's something that any parent, I would suggest, with students in that environment ought to be very concerned about indeed.